So I admit all.
Do you want to be an agent of social change, tackling issues like poverty, inequality, mental health, to be remembered as the protector of the most vulnerable? Fulfill your calling to be a prominent advocate, or simply work behind the scenes, as long as you are creating a better future for generations to come. To deal with the root causes of society's problem, you must first prepare yourself. We can help you get there. As the #1 private university in Malaysia, Taylor's University is offering Asia's pioneering degree in social innovation and change. Get involved. Spark your leadership instincts with the Emerging Leaders Greenhouse program, where you can shadow and learn from prominent national leaders, both on and off campus. Learn how we partner with leading social organizations to drive change in the society. Great leaders set out to make a difference. Lead the change you want to see in the world.
Imagine having the power to impact our future, tackling major issues we face today: political coup, climate change, the fight against a global pandemic. In the midst of it all, will you watch from the sidelines, or will you take the lead? Do you have the passion, the perseverance, and a strong sense of critical thinking? Taylor's University offers Southeast Asia's first work-based learning international relations degree, where in your third year, you will work, learn, and be mentored by game changers in the industry. Diplomats, foreign officials, leaders from international organizations, and top scholars coming together as part of this hands-on, industry-based education, led by Malaysia's most influential, trailblazing leaders. The world is in need of visionary leaders now more than ever. Social leaders who will pioneer change. Be the next global leader now.
A very good evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anindita Dasgupta, and I'm head of School of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Taylor's University, Malaysia. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Malaysian Politics and Public Issues, or MPPI Talks, which is a joint initiative of Zubedy's Unity and Harmony Mediators Movement and Taylor's School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Bachelor of Social Science. Now, on March 11, 2022, Tun Razak would have been 100 years of age. This is surely a most opportune time to reflect on his legacy and achievements. So, ladies and gentlemen, this evening we are privileged to have with us Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, President, International Movement for a Just World, to speak on 11 outstanding achievements of Tun Razak. The MPPI talks, ladies and gentlemen, are moderated by none other than Anas Zubedy himself. Anas Zubedy is the managing director of Zubedy Sendirian Berhad, a training company that focuses on soft skills and making people more productive and better. Zubedy has been promoting unity extensively for the last 3 decades. Anas Zubedy is a senior fellow of Human Resources Development Corporation. Anas is adjunct professor at Taylor's School of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Director of Social Innovation and Change at the Bachelor of Social Science, Taylor's University. It is now my pleasure to invite Anas to take the floor. Take it away, Anas.
Thank you, Anint. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Chandra. I will do a share screen right now. So welcome back to those of us who were here last year. This is going to be the 9th session of our series of our forum. And I'm very happy that we're going to start this year with a talk about Tun Razak. I would like to just go through with you about Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, as usual. First, why are we here? To educate, discuss and promote the exchange of ideas about Malaysian politics and public issues in a mature, rational and justly balanced way. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement of the Just World, or JUST, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. The author and editor of 32 books in English and Malay, many of his writings have been translated into other languages. Among Dr. Chandra's latest publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Reflection on Malaysian Unity and Other Challenges. In 1977, he founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Aliran Negara, or Aliran, which he led for 14 years. Today, apart from his role in JUST, Dr. Chandra sits on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Dr. Chandra was professor and director of Center of Civilizational Dialogue, University of Malaya from 1997-1999, and professor of global studies at University of Science Malaysia from 2007-2012. Dr. Chandra travels abroad frequently, giving lectures and speaking at seminars and conferences. He's also a regular speaker at meetings at home in Malaysia. Dr. Chandra is a recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and social activism. Dr. Chandra is married to Mariam Muhammad Hashim and he has 2 daughters, 2 granddaughters, and 5 grandsons. Welcome back, Dr. Chandra. Thank you so much. Without much ado, I would like to pass to you the floor for you to unpack Tun Razak, his 11th outstanding achievement.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this talk for this very kind invitation. It is an initiative which all Malaysians should be proud of. Organizing a talk on Tun Razak on the 100th birth anniversary of our second minister, which is actually on the 11th of March. We are 2 days ahead, but for various practical reasons, we had hold it on the 9th of March. Friends, why are we holding this? Why are we talking about this man who passed away on the 14th of January, 1976, some years ago? Yes, he was a political leader, he was our second prime minister, but are these the reasons why we are talking about him today? We are talking about him because of his huge impact upon Malaysian society. There is no aspect of Malaysian life that doesn't bear the clear, distinctive footprint of this man's role, of his contribution to the nation. His contributions go beyond the 11 dimensions which I'll try to look at. But I just want to highlight this, mainly for the younger generation, many of whom may not even know what this man did and why we have to honor him. It is to these young people that I would like to dedicate this talk, together with my friends from Zubedy and Taylor's. We are dedicating this lecture to the young, which is why it is held in conjunction with a teaching program for young people at a leading Malaysian university, Taylor's University. Friends, the 11 dimensions of Tun Razak's achievements. The first, the obvious to a lot of people, Tun Razak transformed rural Malaysia. He laid the foundation for the growth and development of rural Malaysia, more than any other single individual. He encouraged the building of roads and bridges, supplying water supply and providing electricity. He built community centers, mosques, and he built health clinics and schools. Some of us were very surprised to learn that before Merdeka, before he took charge of rural development, there was not a single secondary school in rural Malaysia. There were secondary schools, but all in urban Malaysia. But in rural Malaysia, there was not a single secondary school. You only had primary schools. In Malay, in Bahasa Malaysia, primary schools. Because the British felt, and this was stated policy of the colonial master at that time, the British felt that all that the Malays needed was primary education, to make them, in the words of a colonial administrator, to make them better fishermen and better farmers. There were no secondary schools. So Tun Razak pioneered this, building schools, clinics, transforming the environment, giving them a sense of wealth, of well-being. It was one of his great achievements, for which will always be remembered, especially by the older generation. He was rightly called at that time the father of rural development. A second dimension of this contribution related to the first. He was the one who made the eradication of poverty, irrespective of ethnicity, a national policy. It was the first prong of the new economic policy enunciated in 1970. This was the first prong, eradicating poverty regardless of ethnicity. And in the rural parts of Malaysia, it was not just the Malays who were the target of this poverty eradication program. Non-Malays were also part of this, and so were the Bumiputras of Sabah and Sarawak. They were part of this attempt to eradicate poverty. You know, at the time of independence, according to certain figures, 64% of the population lived below the poverty line. And there was some improvement in the 12 years after independence by 1969. And from the figures we have in 1970, something like 49.3% of the population lived below the poverty line. Still a huge percentage of the population living below the poverty line. So this was a mammoth task that he undertook to eradicate poverty. He laid the foundations. Others had to carry the torch in later years. But this was undoubtedly something that was very, very dear to him, eradicating poverty regardless of ethnicity. Now, a third dimension. Tun Razak expanded education. It was not just education for the rural community that he was concerned about. That was the foundation, primary, secondary school education. He gave a tremendous boost to tertiary education. Mara, as an institution that trained young people, provided post-secondary school education. At that time, when he was around, it had not become a university yet, but it was a tertiary institution in the sense that it was a college which provided training in a whole variety of skills. And later, around 1971 or so, we gave a push to higher education in the sense of helping to develop universities in the country. There was only one university until 1969, and the second university was established in 1969, Penang. University of Penang it was called. And then, of course, you had University of Kebangsaan. Tun Razak was directly connected with the establishment of University of Kebangsaan. He felt it was very, very important as a university that would cater for kids from rural Malaysia in particular. And that was his very big contribution to the expansion of higher education. And it is only right that Tun Razak would see education this way, from primary school right up to university, because let's not forget that he was the author, in the sense that he was the chairman of the committee that drew up the Razak report in 1956. Year before Merdeka, we had the Razak report, which has remained to this day the foundation of our education system, the Razak report. And nothing has replaced the Razak report. There have been reviews, but that report has remained the basis of our education policy. Can you imagine, at that time when the Razak report was announced in 1956, Tun Razak was just 34 years old. Just like if you look at everything else in his career, he did things very, very quickly, at a very young age. It's just amazing. 34, he was the chairman of this committee that had a number of prominent educationists and also professionals, people from different communities. And if you look at that education report, it was a far-sighted report. It sought to bring all the communities together, a common education system, the backbone of which would be Bahasa Malaysia as the main medium, but not the sole medium. And that was something that the committee stressed, that Bahasa would be the main medium, not the sole medium. Other languages would be used as media of instruction as appropriate. English was going to play a prominent role in secondary education and in tertiary education, according to that report. Primary education, of course, would be available in different languages, though eventually the aim was to have a common language, not separate schools as such, but a common language, which would unify rather than establish an education system that was uniform. The difference between the two. It would unify while maintaining diversity. You would have some subjects taught in Chinese and Tamil as needed, but there would be a unified education system with Bahasa as the backbone, but an education system that would cater for everyone. And it's very significant that the Razak report did not want to see education system where the students would be classified along ethnic lines, where they would be divided along ethnic lines. The idea was to bring everyone together, a common basis for learning, that would be the critical factor, that they would all be learning together and teachers would also be part of that process, all working together with this common aim. Let us yet another contribution of the man in relation to education. Let me also add that that contribution is related to the fourth dimension that I want to talk about. It's related to unity. He saw unity as very, very important. This is something that was not highlighted by too many people, that unity was very, very important to Tun Razak. Education was one of the vehicles, and he was very committed to this. Tun Razak was also committed to economic restructuring as part of the quest for unity. He knew that the divisions that existed during the colonial period that kept the communities apart, that we could not continue with those divisions. The identification of ethnicity with economic function was inimical to unity. You do not divide people along occupational lines linked to their ethnicity, and he wanted to see that transformed, which is why it became part of the new economic policy, that one would try to reduce the identification of ethnicity with economic function. A huge task, which has still not been completed, but it is so much different today than what it was in 1957 or in 1970-71. Tun Razak really believed that this is something that one should strive to achieve. Wanted to see more Malays and other indigenous people in commerce, industry, the professions, which is why the NEP had this 30% in 20 years target, so that there would be a definite aim and one would work towards that, that Malays who were in a minority position in the professions. And it was an appalling situation, actually. People don't even remember that now. That in 1970, for instance, across the board, with the exception of the teaching profession, all the other professions, medicine, engineering, architecture, even law to some extent, all the other professions, the average for the Malay community in terms of its participation was just 5%. When the Malay community was the majority at that time, but just 5% from the Malay community in the professions. It was an untenable position. It was a situation that certainly did not conduce towards unity. It had to change, and he was determined to change that. But it was wrong to argue that in order to change that, he wanted to create a mono-ethnic civil service and public service, as it is alleged in some quarters. This is totally untrue. Because if you look at the upper echelons of the civil service in his time, many of the top civil servants were actually non-Malays. working together with Malays. You had top Malay civil servants making a huge contribution to the transformation that was taking place in the immediate years after Merdeka and after Tun Razak became Prime Minister in 1970. And you had non-Malays putting their shoulders to the wheel, making an equally important contribution. When I talk to people of that generation, they tell me that people like the late Tan Sri Rama Iyer, Tan Sri Tong Yu Hong, these were individuals who were very, very close to Tun Razak, very much involved in the planning and the implementation of plans connected with all aspects of the economy and of social development at that time. So non-Malays had a prominent role in the upper echelons of the civil and public services at that time. And you had, of course, we must mention these individuals because of their immense contribution, people like Raja Moha, people like the late Zain Azrai, Dr. Agus Salim, many others, helping to achieve the nation's goals at that time. I'm sure I've left out many prominent names, but they're all there as part of the struggle, people from the civil and public services, apart from others who are in the cabinet and so on, whom I'll mention in passing later on. Apart from this restructuring in terms of the occupational pattern in the country, Tun Razak also promoted the Malay language. He elevated the status of the Malay language, which was the national and official language from 1957, but he gave it a prominence that he did not enjoy before that. In other words, he ensured that it was implemented. It was not just, a slogan. It had to be implemented. And he had the support of both Tun Abdul Rahman and Tun Ismail, which again is something else that one has to emphasize. It is something that is not widely known, that all three of them were behind the National Language Act of 1967, which envisaged a transition to Bahasa in the various spheres of our life, including the courts, the civil and public services, the private sector, and so on, over a period of time, but done in a very gradual manner, without disrupting national progress in any way. And that was something that all of them were equally committed to, strengthening the status of Bahasa. Now, in spite of all these efforts, we know that we had a tragic riot, an ethnic riot, from all accounts, in 1969, May 13th. Tun Razak played a very big role in bringing that riot under control, restoring peace and order, and re-establishing a fractured nation, in strengthening a nation which was on the brink of a huge tragedy. But he, together with his very close friend, the late Dr. Ismail, who returned to the cabinet after the May 13th riots, they played a huge role in restoring law and order and re-establishing peace. Tun Razak, together with his colleagues, also did something else, which is very important, and its importance has not been emphasized enough. Not only did he restore peace following the riots, he also amended the Malaysian constitution. That amendment to the constitution, there were 4 different areas that had to be amended. That amendment had contributed to our peace and stability. As a young academic at that time, I had publicly supported the amendments because I could see its worth and value. I'll just highlight 2 of those amendments. In the interest of time, we won't be able to discuss this in detail. but he amended two areas in the Constitution which had made a massive contribution to restoring not only peace and order and interethnic relations, it also set the tone and tenor of our society. He amended the clauses pertaining to the special position of the Malays and other indigenous people, because he knew that it was an issue that had been debated and discussed, and it had created a lot of division and a lot of unhappiness within Malaysian society. In the 1969 elections, it was undoubtedly one of the two major issues that confronted the people. It was exploited by different sides for different reasons, the special position. The position taken by Tun Razak and his colleagues, and one must add at this point that this included some of the leading figures from the opposition. They supported him on this and the other clauses of the Constitution that were amended. They felt that special position had to be entrenched. It should not be subjected to continuous debate. It should not create the sort of heartburn within our society, the sort of situation that would be a permanent sore in Malaysian society. You had to tell people that the special position had to be there as part of the nation building process. One could not wish it away. Why? Because the special position is linked to the history of our land. Its special position in specific terms, in terms of language, in terms of the special position clauses, largely socioeconomic, and also special position in relation to the position of the monarchs, that this had to be entrenched. It should not be an issue that would be a permanent division within Malaysian society. Why? Because that history is so vital to the Malay community and to the indigenous people as a whole. It is what defines them. It defines their position. It defines their identity. It defines their sense of belonging. It links them to the land and its history. I've argued it is because what was a Malay polity did not eventually lead to a Malay nation. This did not happen. It did not happen because of the way history unfolded in our country. It was a land that had to be shared with other communities. Because that did not happen. Now, this was something very, very important. And a lot of people in our country, they don't appreciate this. That the issues pertaining to citizenship were very significant in the 1969 elections. And those who raised citizenship were those who felt that the citizenship clauses that were adopted eventually and incorporated into the Constitution were unfair to the Malays. And it was an issue that led to the loss of two very Malay states in the 1959 election, Kelantan and Terengganu. And so in 69, 10 years after that, 10 years after Malaysian Malaysia and all the rest of that, these issues had the impact upon the electorate. And these issues were also amended. The clauses pertaining to these issues were amended so that no one could debate those things. They had to accept citizenship as provided for in the Constitution. They were entrenched. This was to protect the interests of the non-Malay communities in the country. And at the seriousness of these issues, you can see from how it impacted upon the electorate. But a largely Malay leadership, they went ahead and argued that if one wanted a certain degree of peace and harmony in our society, just as one amended those clauses pertaining to special position, the clauses pertaining to citizenship also had to be amended. so that no one could question the citizenship, the underlying principles that governed the granting of citizenship to the non-Malays. So that was also amended in 1971 when Parliament was restored. So this was yet another major contribution. It was a very difficult time, and I alluded to this a while ago that it's not just government leaders, but the opposition that supported this. These amendments, together with the amendments pertaining to language and the position of the monarchy, they had the support of PAS, they had the support of the Gerakan, and they had the support of the PPP, the People's Progressive Party at that time. And some of the speeches made by the Gerakan leaders in and outside Parliament were eye-opener. They told us a great deal about how these leaders saw the integration of the nation in the future, why certain things had to be done in the transition to a united Malaysian nation in the future. So Tun Razak secured the support of not just his own alliance at that time, which later became the Barisan Nasional, but also these other parties. Some of those parties joined the alliance in the expanded Barisan Nasional. So that was yet another major step that he took. It was very controversial at that time. Those of us who are looking at that issue today, we don't realize how difficult it was, how sensitive these amendments were. But like restoring peace and order after the riots, this is something that had to be done, and the Razak leadership was prepared to stake everything in ensuring that these amendments were passed by both the lower house and the upper house. And that brings me directly, friends, to yet another of his achievements, his sixth achievement, linked to what had happened and linked to what I had just discussed in particular. The amendments, not many people again are aware of this, were actually debated not just within political parties, but within the National Consultative Council that was established after the riots. The same National Consultative Council that produced the Rukun Negara debated these amendments, and eventually, of course, the Constitutional Council had to formulate the Rukun Negara. 5 principles, 5 goals, the Rukun Negara. This again, sadly, has not been given the prominence it deserves. It was not just 5 goals, but there were also 5 principles that were part of the Rukun Negara. And the way in which it was formulated by a number of these people who were around Tun Razak at that time, with his guidance and leadership. It was formulated in such a way that one would, in a sense, establish a link between the past and the present and the future. That was the thinking behind the Rukun Negara. The principles, like constitution, monarchy, rule of law, those were all part of the present in a sense. But the future, a just society, a democratic society, a united society, these were aspirations. And they were called aspirations in the original draft of the Rukun Negara, the 5 aspirations linked to these 5 principles, which showed a certain degree of sophistication, of maturity, that we should work towards these aspirations, that these are the real aspirations of our Malaysian people. They're not linked to ethnicity as such. If you look at the way the just society is articulated in the Rukun Negara, it is not linked to ethnic privilege in any way. If you look at democracy, it is devoid of any mention of ethnicity. If you look at unity, if you look at a liberal society, a progressive society, these are ideas which are well in advance of their time. And these are going to be the goals for the nation. The Rukun Negara is undoubtedly one of the great contributions that Tun Razak had made, because they have a series of meetings, support various groups, again, both the then opposition and government parties. Some of the civil society groups at that time, they're not many, they were all part of this process of formulating the Rukun Negara. It is the most consultative process you can think of if you compare it to some of the other attempts to create national charters in Malaysia. Since then, this was undoubtedly the most democratic process, the creation of the Rupa Negara. Leads me to the seventh dimension of his achievements. Tun Razak also ensured that there was political stability in the country, which he knew could not be achieved merely through resolving a riot or merely through amendments to the constitution. There had to be a political mechanism to ensure political stability. And that he did through the expansion of the fractured alliance, the alliance which in the 69 elections saw a major setback. It barely kept its two-thirds majority, and that with the help of the Sarawak United People's Party, it managed to retain its two-thirds majority. But what really helped in the survival of that alliance, of that coalition, was actually the expansion. First, SUPP was brought in, then other political parties, and this was mainly Tun Razak. He, more than any single individual, had to bring these parties together, consolidated them, and created an expanded coalition, a multi-ethnic, inter-community alliance, which was solid, which covered for the first time the East Malaysian states of Sabah and Sarawak. And that coalition, friends, provided the political stability, which now when we look at politics in the country and, what has happened since 2018, the challenges to political stability and how things have unfolded, we realize that sort of stability is important. The stability that had an anchor, inter-ethnic, inter-party coalition, and it provided stability for 45 years, for 45 long years. And the one who laid the foundation for that was Tun Razak. That brings me to the eighth dimension that I want to talk about. Tun Razak was also concerned, and he knew that this was very important, that one wanted to have stability in the real sense, not just a stability that keeps the coalition in power, that keeps the elites in power, but a stability which leads to improvement in the lives of people, that will address the real challenges facing the people who had to fight corruption. This was imperative. One had to ensure that there was an effective mechanism to curb corruption. And that he had begun to do together with the Tunku and other leaders way back in 1967. Malaysia had the first anti-corruption agency for a country in the global south. The ACA, the Anti-Corruption Agency, established in 1967 under Harun Hashim, the late Tan Sri Harun Hashim. No other country in the south had set up such a mechanism. Laws giving meaning to this fight against corruption were enacted. There was an institution, there were individuals, and there was a certain degree of earnestness at the beginning in fighting corruption. In 1969, in the midst of the emergency, and Tun Razak was the director of the National Operations Council that restored peace and order, he also introduced changes to the laws in the fight against corruption. He tightened those rules and regulations. This was yet another contribution of his that reflected his determination to ensure that corruption was brought under control, even though it was not as serious as it has been since then. And if you look at all the problems that they've had and the challenges and all the rest of it, but in '69 it was there, but it had to be tamed. This brings me to the ninth dimension of the challenge. You know, we deliberately decided on 11 challenges because he was born on the 11th of March, and we thought it would be a nice way of conceptualizing the challenges that he dealt with. But the ninth challenge here, he restored ties between Indonesia and Malaysia. Again, it was not just Tun Razak, just like all the other things, so many others involved. Here, a person involved, an outsider, played a very big role in restoring ties between the two countries was Adam Malik of Indonesia. Adam Malik of Indonesia and Tun Razak of Malaysia. They were the two outstanding figures in trying to restore ties between Malaysia and Indonesia, strengthening ties between Indonesia and Malaysia, whatever the reasons behind confrontation and all the rest of it. It was important to restore the ties between these two countries because that helped to ensure that ASEAN would succeed. If that was not done and if it was not addressed at that time, perhaps ASEAN would have been in a different place. But this was a major achievement as part of regional cooperation. And number 10, Tun Razak also paved the way for relations between communist China at that time and non-communist Southeast Asia. Non-communist Southeast Asia. Malaysia became the first country to establish ties with communist China, non-communist Southeast Asia to establish ties with communist China in 1974. Tun Razak pioneered this. Many of the very bright civil servants he had around him, they were part of that process that led eventually to the establishment of ties between Malaysia and China. And given China's role, not only in Southeast Asia, but in the world today, you can see why this was so important. You saw the worth and value of this. This is something that the Chinese have never forgotten, which is why I'm told by both Chinese diplomats and Malaysian diplomats that normally after the Chinese ambassador, a new Chinese ambassador is presented his credentials to the king, one of the first visits that he makes is to the family of the late Tun Razak. He would call upon his widow, who unfortunately is also passed on. So the ties with China, very, very important for Malaysia and for Southeast Asia as a whole, and for the world. If you look at the role that China has played and the role that we have played in sort of developing that relationship and also in ensuring that problems that have emerged from time to time between Southeast Asian countries and China, that behind the scenes, Malaysia would be able to play a role because of the respective command amongst the Chinese and amongst countries of Southeast Asia. Finally, the 11th dimension of this contributions of this leader. Tun Razak, more than anyone else, steered Malaysia in the direction of non-alignment. We were not part of the non-aligned movement before he became Prime Minister. It was quite controversial within the civil service, us becoming part of the non-aligned movement because we were a very pro-British nation, more pro-British than pro-United States of America, but we were also pro-United States of America. We supported the United States in the war in Vietnam, for instance, in the late 60s. Tun Razak initiated changes in that sort of atmosphere. Can you imagine where you have that sort of thinking? It's dominant, it's overpowering. But this man slowly changed that sort of thinking and made Malaysia part of the non-aligned movement. And eventually we were to play an important role in the non-aligned movement. You may like to know, friends, that it was also Tun Razak who in 1967, at that time not Prime Minister, but of course the dominant figure in government, he helped to establish relations with Russia. Tun Razak was also the person who helped to establish relations with Little Cuba, because he felt that if you were going to be truly non-aligned and you're going to play a role in international affairs, you're going to be fair and just, we had to have relations with states which were seen as communist, which were communist at that time. And that was one of the achievements because we've remained non-aligned. And that issue has come up from time to time. How should a non-aligned nation look at challenges, crises from time to time, including like what's happening in Ukraine and so on? How do you approach situations of this sort? Non-alignment was a much better approach to adopt than to be totally aligned to one side or the other. Now, those are the 11 achievements. I'm sure there are many other achievements that others can think about, and we can talk about these achievements in the future. These 11 achievements would serve as a starting point, I hope, especially for discussions we'll be having on Tun Razak. In the next 2 days, we are going to have another panel discussion with some of my friends and colleagues. They will be participating in that discussion, and you will see many other dimensions of the man. I want to conclude this talk by highlighting 2 or 3 things. Number one, if you reflect on Tun Razak's achievements, we have to acknowledge that none of these things would have been possible without certain attributes, characteristics that he had as a person. And that is important whenever you talk about leadership in politics. When political scientists look at leadership, they cannot ignore the attributes of the individual who is at the center of the stage. And Tun Razak, hardworking, dedicated, selfless, a man who sacrificed everything for the nation and for a larger cause. That was a major factor. No one can deny this. A lot of people were close to him, and I must state this quite openly. Of all the prime ministers, he's the only prime minister that I've not met at all. I did not meet him at any point. I did not know him at all. But from what I've read and from what I've heard from people, he was truly selfless. He was also a person who was inclined towards consultation and who tried to bring different forces together, as you can see, not just the post-May 13th situation, but also the way he set up the Barisan Nasional and Indonesia-Malaysia relations, strengthening ASEAN and all the rest of it. That was his inclination. He was a problem solver, a person who brought people together, who was very much inclined towards consultation, towards seeking the middle path, reconciling people, reconciling situations. It should also be highlighted that Tun Razak was a person who valued integrity above everything else. You don't get this from the man's speeches. He seldom talked about himself. But if you talk to the people who were with him, and we had over the years talked to some of these individuals, and from my conversations with these individuals, people like Tun Razak, who worked very closely with Tun Razak, people like Tun Kuma, chairman of the Razak Foundation. What impressed them most was his integrity, his impeccable integrity. He's a man who was so conscious about separating the public from the private, to a point where even in very small things, where he felt that that division, that line, the demarcating line was important, he would insist that one observed that demarcation. of how he had upbraided, admonished one of his civil servants for including the purchase of a toothpaste in the bill that the state was supposed to settle because he had forgotten to bring his toothpaste on one of his trips. When the civil servant did this thinking it was something harmless, he was asked to rectify his mistake immediately. A person who sort of agonized over his wife making the trip to London when he was very ill, because there was no provision in the general orders for a spouse to visit her husband in hospital in a foreign country. And eventually, when it was resolved, it was done through, from what I've been told, private contributions that enabled her to be with her husband. He was very scrupulous about these things, which is really remarkable. He led a very simple life, was very frugal, very concerned about what is purchased in the name of the state, what it costs. This was always a constant reminder that he conveyed to his staff. And he always made sure that integrity was up, was very much against corruption. So were the others around him. People like Tun Dr. Ismail, Tun Tan Siew Sin, Tun Meteor Sabantan, the late Tun Hussein On. They're very concerned about this, which is, I think, why it was a different world at that time. They set the tone and tenor for Malaysia. What it has become over the years, it is something else, but this is something that they did because they valued a certain notion of integrity, how integrity should be demonstrated not through words but through deeds. That's one of his great contributions, without any doubt at all. I'm sure others who knew him well would have a lot more to say about this. Finally, friends, in the study of politics, especially politics in post-independent societies, people talk very often about the solidarity makers and the problem solvers, those with great visions were described as the solidarity makers, and those who solved problems, who concentrated on just solving problems. This classification had been used in the study of Indonesian politics, for instance. Political scientists, the late Herb Feith, talked of solidarity makers and problem solvers. Sukarno was a solidarity maker, the great vision, but he was not a problem solver. Problem solver was supposed to be Muhammad Hatta, the vice president. But Tun Razak was that rare human being who was both a solidarity maker and a problem solver. This is very, very rare in history. And yet it's a shame that we haven't really highlighted this man and his role, his contribution. Amongst the pantheon of Asian leaders, and some of them were giants, I think this is something that one has to highlight, one has to acknowledge this, that here was this rare combination of both a visionary, and that was in the Rukunegara, and in his other endeavors linked to the nation, to Southeast Asia, ASEAN. But he was also a problem solver who knew in meticulous detail what was happening in almost every part of the country. He knew these issues, he addressed them, the simplest, commonest issues facing ordinary people. He was very much aware of these things. And did something extraordinary. So for me, as a student of politics, one is paying tribute to a very rare political icon, a person who combined these two dimensions. And as a result of that, his nation benefited, his people benefited. We've all benefited from this man's extraordinary contribution. Friends, hope that in the years to come, generations to come, they will continue to acknowledge, and more than acknowledge, they'll continue to live up to what he was. It'll be very difficult for this nation to produce another Tun Razak. It seldom happens in history, but we can try to emulate his great achievements to the limited extent that we, as ordinary mortals, are capable of. And there will be many others, people coming to the fore in the decades to come. We hope that he will be a beacon for all of them, and a beacon for generations of young people in particular, so that we will be able to say, well, here was a man, an extraordinary man. He is our inspiration. He is what we aspire to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Thank you very much for very thorough. Even though within 1 hour, you have covered from his achievements, both locally, regionally, and internationally. First, I'd like to apologize just now for some disturbances. For a while, we have to actually remove quite a few people. And also 1 or 2 accounts using my name, my team, they're using my name, but it's not me typing, so be careful if you read anything as though I'm suggesting something. And yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Chandra. And what I'll do is, we already have 3 questions sent in, and some of the things you'll handle, but maybe we can unpack it further. I will read out the questions. One second. Yeah. The first question is from Hanif Hamid. Speaker to describe the outcome or results of those achievements as they stand today. Even though the policy was made in the 70s, how is it today? You know, what Tun Razak planned, how is it today, and are we actually living up to his plan and his goals? Perhaps one question at a time.
Well, if you look at the goals of the Rukunegara, and if you look at some of the standards that he set, I suppose an honest answer would be that we have failed him. I remember a line from my late friend Rehman Rashid's. I think it is the book called Peninsula, if I'm not mistaken, where he says that the generation that came after these important leaders, Tun Razak and others, their generation was the generation that dropped the ball. They dropped the ball. I think to some extent it's true. The immediate generation after Tun Razak, those who, well, would be, around, people in public life and so on, they've not really been able to continue those goals, the ideals, the passion, the commitment, not there. And if you ask me, and ask, what is it that led to the situation? I think it's very complex. It'll take a long while to give a thorough answer, but I just want to highlight two factors which I think will be responsible for this situation, why we've not been able to continue. One, I think just because success sometimes has a deadening effect on people when it comes to sustaining change. A deadening effect on people when it comes to sustaining change. In other words, because you are quite successful, as we were in the past, right? In certain areas, we were quite successful. I don't think people saw the need to exert themselves, to do well, to do better, to continue that sort of struggle. It would have been different if we had failed. And people have said, look, we should do better, we should endeavor and so on. And just as even in our case, I suppose, after May 13th, people felt the urgency to come up with something and so on. So that was one of the reasons why immediately after these leaders, because things were okay or seemed to be okay, they didn't really exert themselves to pursue certain ideals. And if you look at the post-mid-70s and so on, economic growth, there's a lot of economic growth, contrary to what people say, because of NEP and so on, it affected growth. No, it didn't actually. Growth was quite remarkable. And there was a certain degree of prosperity and all the rest of it. And people thought that, they should not be focusing upon, how to really strive and to achieve and all the rest of it. I think that was part of the reason that the situation also contributed to this inability to exert ourselves. And I would argue that it is also, in a sense, linked to something historical. If you look at the way we treat leaders, Malaysia, as a whole, the way we treated Tun Jaafar in the past, even today, I think for a man who founded AMNO, he was not the only one, of course, we know that, but he played a major role. He was the man who rose to the occasion, mobilized people, which was very difficult at that time, given the position of the rulers, which was different on the issue of the Malayan Union. People don't highlight this, don't forget that the rulers signed the Malayan Union. But Tun, he mobilized the people and so on. Do we remember Tun? Do we acknowledge his great contribution? We don't. To be fair to someone like the Tunku, and this is something which he demonstrated in reality, and something which I remember in the conversations I had with him, over years, in Penang, the Tunku had always mentioned this, that he was always grateful to Tun, which is why he said, the road leading to the Prime Minister's office was once called Jalan Tun. He knew what the man had done, his contribution. But generally, I think a lot of people, they don't acknowledge people in the past. Tunku has not been acknowledged as he should be. His great contribution. And usually these are the chaps at the middle and lower levels, who behave this way, not the people who are right at the top. And the same thing has happened to Razak, to others. This inability to acknowledge, to understand what is achieved. This, I think, is also a factor. Tun Razak, you look at this talk that you and others have taken the trouble to organize. And the response has been quite lukewarm, to put it mildly. It has been very lukewarm. Why? Because I think for many people it means nothing. Tun Razak, who is Tun Razak? What he did in the past, one doesn't really care. I think this is yet another factor why we are in this sort of situation. Because we don't remember, we have historical memory, we don't have a strong sense of history, historical memory, and also I think we are complacent, lulled into that complacency because of this false sense of success. We're great, we've succeeded, that sort of thing.
We've lost our fire.
Yeah.
We have lost our fire, you're saying.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah? And these I think are some of the reasons, why we have not really valued what he has done, and so we don't really measure against that, past.
Thank you, Chandra. Let me take you to the second question. For those who have questions, you can start typing in. The second question comes from Johan, or rather request, Johan Abdul Razak. This is something I think a lot of people talk about. Can you please comment on the assertion that May 13 was instigated as a coup to topple Tunku Abdul Rahman in order to implement Malay agenda, and that Tun Razak was behind all this? This is one of those that we hear all the time, Chandra. Yeah, so maybe a comment from you.
Yeah. I've heard this, of course, and, as a student of society, I've been concerned about this, and I'm trying to do modest research into this. I think it is just nonsense. Just nonsense, this thing that Tun Razak was behind this coup to overthrow the Tunku and all the rest of it. It would require a lot of time, including things I've heard from people who are around Tun Razak, around Tunku and all the rest of it. But to put it very briefly, there was a coup. Then people like Tan Chi Koon, the late Dr. Tan Chi Koon, the late B. David, and others must have played a role in that coup. Because we look at what led to that riot, it was the procession through areas which were populated by Malays, and the way feelings were instigated and so on. People say that these things were all done deliberately. So are we saying that Shifu, David, and others worked together with Tun Razak to create this situation, which I think doesn't make any sense? And you look at the accounts of people who were with Razak, including someone, and I've talked in great detail with that person, who was with him during the entire campaign period. The entire campaign period, he said he didn't notice anything to suggest that Tun Razak was behind a huge coup of that sort, because he was working as hard as anyone else to ensure that the alliance did well in that election. I know that the Tunku believed in some of these things, because there were people who went to him and said, "Oh yeah, this had happened," and so on. But in terms of actual proof, they've not been able to show this. And the guys who have said this, they rely upon documents like reports by foreign correspondents, many of them Western correspondents, what they'd written, the stories they had found, those stories which are kept in the London archives and so on. This is totally unreliable if you look at the way these things are done. And I don't want to go into great detail in this, but I remember as a student in Singapore, the University of Singapore, how some of these reporters tried to use those of us who would get into a particular hall at a certain time, because they wanted to write a very negative report on Lee Kuan Yew. And so some of us, student leaders, they approached us and, well, they basically tried to bribe us into saying certain things, finding certain stories with them, and they would file these stories with their respective newspapers and so on. And, we refused to do this. So I think these are things which are done, reporters who do these things. I'm not castigating the whole lot of them. I'm not saying all reporters are like that. They've been very fine reporters, journalists over the years, but there are many who do this also. Like the figures that they gave, to give you another example to support my response to that question. The figures of those who had, the number who had died. While the government has been able to provide its official figures, you find that those exaggerated figures, none of them have been able to substantiate those figures, substantiate them, saying, yeah, this is correct because yes, this particular obituary, this particular mortuary, there were so many bodies, or that families in this particular area, so many hundreds were killed and all the rest of it. This happens in other places too. These things are exaggerated beyond the pale, and then people come up with these stories and say this is what has happened, when actually in reality it would have been quite different. I don't think Tun Razak would want to do a thing like that, even if there were people who are unhappy with the Tunku, and that unhappiness was shown not through these maneuvers and manipulations and so on at the elite level. It was shown in elections in that year, in 1969. The Tunku barely won in Langkawi, just by less than 2,000 votes. We did very badly. I mean, if you compare to Tun Razak's performance in the election. So there was a certain sentiment against the Tunku. That is a fact. A certain sentiment, especially among the Malays, against the Tunku. Whether that sentiment was justified or not is another matter, right? But there was that sentiment. And then you had people manipulating, yes, that sentiment, right? Sentiment is there, it was political, they manipulated, and these were people who wanted to gain from perhaps the Tunku's ouster, so that they could be, in the corridors of power. But for Tun Razak himself, and I think for him, his relationship with the Tunku, if I may just mention this, Anas, the man who made Tunku the president of UMNO, succeeding Dato' On, was actually Tun Razak. People know this. That here was this person in his late 20s, very young. And that Dato' On wanted him to take over the presidency of UMNO. He refused. And he said, I know someone else who's not in politics, but I know he can lead. And he was the one given his relationship with the Tunku in London. He was very, very close to Tunku. I mean, he helped Tunku pass the bar finals.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, read to him, helped him, coached him, and all the rest of it. So what Tun Razak did was, he went to the Tunku, who was a DPP at that time, public process, and asked him whether he would, come in and help UMNO at that time. And in many ways, it was like many other choices that Tun Razak had made in his life, in terms of people, individuals that he picked up and so on. It was the right choice. Tunku was wealthy, Tunku had leadership, ability. I think the outstanding quality about the Tunku, which was very, very useful in the 50s, was he could bring different communities together. And that was something which was so manifest in his personality. I come from Kedah, Anas, People in Kedah knew this. My grandfather was close to the Tunku, and he knew how well the Tunku was liked. I've seen in my late father's library, document, sort of a letter to the British, signed by the community leaders, different communities. My grandfather was the leader of the Indian community for that part of Kedah. And they had appealed to the British to keep the Tunku as the DO, district officer in Kuala Muda, Central Kedah, at that time, because it was so popular. It was so popular, and when the taxi drivers protested against something that was unjust, he as DO, who should be on the other side, he joined the taxi drivers.
They form a convoy or something, right? I remember reading.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So, Tunku was that sort of person, who could bring different communities together. He had that ability. So I don't think Tun Razak, given their history and their past, he would have done that to the Tunku. And I don't think the Tunku would have wanted to do in Tun Razak either, but there were other forces at work, it's true, But nonetheless, I think that is distortion. It's a pity that some academics have also contributed to this without really analyzing what had happened here.
Thank you, Chandra. Let me take to the next question. The next question is from Prof. Dato' Dr. GP Doraisamy. the establishment of the Malaysia-China bilateral relationship, how well this friendship has endured and lasted till today. I think you spoke about it, but maybe you can unpack it or extrapolate it. How is it today? Yeah?
Well, I think China-Malaysia relations are healthy, and to use a diplomatic term, are very healthy. We have had no major problem with China. And there have been occasions where other countries in Southeast Asia, ASEAN member states, have had problems from time to time, including Singapore, which is 76% Chinese, but has had problems with China. But Malaysia, they managed the relationship quite well. We have not kowtowed to China as such. I mean, there are occasions where you can see this in some of the ASEAN communiques and so on, where Malaysia, together with other ASEAN countries, have taken a position on South China Sea, on issues of that sort. And we have been the sort of middle road as ASEAN. We are not pro-China the way in which some ASEAN states are, given their economic ties, given historical ties and so on. And we are not anti-China, unlike some other ASEAN states, which are not anti-China, but they are sort of more skeptical about China, and some of the most the Chinese have made. We've had good relations, and I think this is very useful. And I hope we'll be able to maintain that. Maintain our dignity, maintain our integrity as a nation, but at the same time, take positions that are right. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to be more difficult in the future, because I see the whole question of Southeast Asia and where it is and what it will be able to do in the coming years. I see this as a very, very critical challenge, given the rise of China and the US's response to China.
Thank you, Chandra. And it's almost 9:20 now, 9:20 plus, and no other questions. So perhaps thank you so much, Dr. Chandra. And we also videotape this. We're gonna post it up in our social media. So for those who want to watch it again, especially the students, it's very helpful. I will pass back to Anindita, and I also will share our some notes of Dr. Chandra at the chat. Yeah? Dr. Chandra, thank you so much. Anindita, I pass to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Chandra, for the wonderful discussion, very insightful. And Anas for moderating the session so eloquently as always. So ladies and gentlemen, our next MPPI talk will be held after Hari Raya. So we'll be sending out communication to you and inform you in a timely manner of the upcoming sessions. So please do follow our Facebook page, Taylor's Bachelor of Social Science, as well as Anas Zubedi's Facebook page for intimations of our forthcoming webinars. So do join us after Hari Raya on a Wednesday evening, once again at 8 p.m. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy, and a very good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much. I'm still, fetching in the notes. Those who want the note, just give me a while.
Can we take a photo, a screenshot for everyone?
Event. Thank you very much, everyone. Sounds Datra.
Yeah.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Shall the team wait for a while? Yeah.
Yes.
We have to discuss about the next time. You have to be careful with attacks since the first time you're having it.
Can somebody stop the live stream?
Yes,
Thank
yeah.
you.